am recording this webinar for those who cannot attend, so I need to let you know from the legal aspect that this webinar is being recorded. And it will be available for Future Fuels Outlook members. It'll be posted probably later today, and then there'll be a post highlighting some of the discussions and some of what's presented. The presentations will be posted, and I have also been doing a transcript, which I think is has been you have been telling me is very, very useful to sort of scan through. So that will be posted as well, probably in the next week or so. So I'm going to just kick it off here and start with sort of a global context. So what I plan to do is, so this webinar focuses a lot on the U.S. experience. I had thought to initially do sort of a global webinar, but I think there's so much going on, and I think that's one of the keys to, understanding what's happening is a lot will happen in terms of growing this market, just like we see in fuel quality improvement, in fuel economy improvement, in biofuels, the pace at which the electric vehicle market's going to grow is going to happen at different paces, and there will be different, sort of causes and conditions that will be unique to a country, even a state, provincial, and even a city. So what I'm going to do is a webinar or a web conference next year that focuses on Europe. Maybe I'll also do one in Asia, and maybe I'll also do one in Canada as well that sort of looks at, sort of the unique causes and conditions that affect those areas. So, but I want to just give a quick global context because I've been following these issues. So this slide shows INDCs are the intended nationally determined contributions. So for the Paris Agreement, before it was negotiated almost 2 years ago, countries had to say what kind of measures they wanted to put in place to help meet greenhouse gas reduction targets in the transport area. So I've talked about this before. Biofuels actually is sort of the #1 strategy. Fuel economy is very close #2, and zero emission vehicle mandates is #3. So the big drivers there, as we all know, are climate change and decarbonizing transport, which is really interesting because despite what we've seen in the oil industry, I mean, typically in the past, in my career, I've worked on alternative fuels for over 20 years now. And the theme has generally been, when oil prices go down, that's kind of the end of, an alternative fuel initiative. But that is not happening this time. So why? The decarbonization of transport is the big piece of that. The second big piece of that is dealing with air pollution. And that's really taken on a really a life of its own and a new importance because we're learning more about the complexity of air pollution and how different pollutants, different molecules, interact with one another, and we're learning more about the impacts to the human body. So there's really not a week that goes by that I don't see something about, the two big ones, particulate matter and NOx or NO2, so nitrogen dioxide and nitrogen oxide. So there's not a week that goes by where I don't see something about the impacts to the body. Everything from Alzheimer's, heart disease, kidney disease, lung disease, and the fact that there are more cars on the road than ever before. We had a Dieselgate scandal, which has really impacted the European market. And so you mix all of that together, along with country competitiveness, countries wanting to stay ahead of the game. I think that's very much part of this new energy vehicle policy in China. You mix all of those factors together, and you start to get countries really, really interested in the zero emission vehicle market. So this chart or this map shows the countries that have committed to put into place some kind of zero emission vehicle mandate. Even countries in Africa are beginning to look at this, believe it or not. So just quickly, these are the countries that have put in place policies to support electric vehicle uptake, and they run the gamut. I think the most important drivers, aside from an actual mandate, which we now have in China, there are two. One are the financial incentives that are in place, and the second are fuel economy standards. So the tougher and tougher fuel economy standards are getting, the more the technology becomes a bit more expensive, and you start to see, if not parity, because I don't think we're there yet, but you start to see the gap closing. So this chart comes from IEA and shows the evolution of the car stock from 2010 to 2016. And what I have here, the numbers here are the actual numbers that were sold, and then the percentages are the percentage growth over the previous year. So the growth has been absolutely enormous over the last 6-7 years or so, and the projection is that growth will continue. So this one took me a while to kind of put together, but I wanted to find a way to show you all, there's a projection study that comes out, literally every week, along with the air pollution studies, I'm looking at, EV projection or EV penetration studies. And so what I wanted to do is try and put those in some kind of timeline to see what we could see. So what I've done is I've taken the percentage that the organization has said, the amount, the percentage penetration for electric vehicles, and by year, and sort of put it on the chart. So you can see the more conservative side from, an Exxon and an IEA, and you can see where Bloomberg New Energy Finance sort of fits in there. And then you sort of have the outliers like DNV, which is projecting a 90% penetration by 2027, I believe, which is very progressive. So where's the commonality? The commonality seems to be in the red circle, where you have some studies that sort of say, projections that say somewhere between 10 and 20% global penetration sometime between the year 2025 and 2030. But I also wanted to include a forecast that comes from IEA. So IEA has looked at, okay, in order to meet 2C, sort of keep the climate Armageddon from happening, to meet the 2C commitments under the Paris Agreement, what would that look like? If we reached 66% of that goal, what would have to happen? And that's what the red diamonds stand for. So you can see there's alignment there with the studies from Total, Morgan Stanley, Wood Mac, similar, not too unaligned, BNP, UBS, and then you can see IEA's growth, which actually around 2040 aligns with Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and then where we need to be by 2050 to sort of get to that 66%. So it's an enormous task and an enormous challenge to even. I mean, we're not talking about 100%. Here for the passenger car fleet, we're talking 66%. So it's quite a challenge the world is facing with transport in general, and passenger car transport in particular. So before I turn it over to Eric to talk about the infrastructure aspects of this, what I'm going to be doing for clients, since many of you are on this webinar, is, there's projections, there's forecasts, there's models. I've been part of building them. I've led modeling and forecast teams. I've been part of modeling and forecast teams. I've done forecasting. And I just, I feel like there's something that's kind of missing there that would kind of help provide insight, because many of you are really trying to determine, on both the opportunity side and the challenges side, just, where are these markets coming? How fast and when? And I think there's some simple ways to approach that on the, maybe more somewhat quantitative but more qualitative side. So I'm going to be developing a scorecard that sort of looks at different demographic, macroeconomic factors, looks at the country's fuel economy situation, fuel quality situation, whether they have a biofuels mandate, what kind of incentives they currently offer, if any, what's their, GDP like, there's just a lot of different sort of factors to see what we can see. How much do they spend on infrastructure, for example? One of the barriers and issues for electric vehicles are fuel taxation, because countries are very dependent on that revenue. Also, import vehicle taxation. So by looking at and beginning to compile some of those factors, I think we can start to get some additional insight into where markets may be coming and where markets may not be coming. I think that could be a really useful tool, but it's meant to be collaborative, so and iterative. So the first iteration will come out in December. I'm working on it now, and I really hope for feedback and exchange on that to really make this something that's living and hopefully beneficial and useful for all of you. So before I turn it over to Eric, I thought it'd be really interesting to show this. This is a survey that was done recently by the American Automobile Association, AAA, and shows the pros and cons of driving electric. And if you look at the reasons against buying an electric vehicle, it really gets to some of the themes and points that are going to be made in the presentations today. So infrastructure and vehicle costs are two major concerns for consumers, but I think as time goes on, I think that will lessen and lessen. So with that, I'm going to introduce Eric Wood with NRail. I saw him here. Okay. Okay, Eric, I'm going to make you the presenter. We can't hear you, so you'll need to unmute your line. So you just need to enter the audio pin #42#. Okay, I see. Here we go.
Oh, hey, how about
now? Okay, we're good. We're all a go.
Okay, great. And I've got a dual monitor setup here, and I'm not sure which monitor is being projected. Can you guys see any slides right now?
I see a very nice screenshot of birds.
Okay. How about now?
Okay, that's good. We're seeing slides.
There it is. There it is. Great. All right. Thanks for hanging with me, guys. Oh, dang it. So you guys are probably seeing the display mode now, aren't you?
Yes, but that's fine. We can see perfectly, or at least I can.
Okay, great. Well, I'll go ahead then. So thanks for the introduction, Tammy. So as was introduced, my name is Eric Wood with the National Renewable Energy Lab in Denver, Colorado. And then just wanted to make a presentation for everyone this morning on a recent study we did here at the lab looking at national requirements for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So the presentation kind of starts out with an quick snapshot of where the EV market is today currently in the US. And so we've got a map here, a heat map that shows locations of registrations across the country. I think this map actually is a little bit deceiving. So if you look at this bar plot that we've got in the upper right, basically you can quarter the electric vehicle market in the US and say that about half of the registrations are currently in California. About the other half are approximately outside of the state of California. With a total of about 500,000 vehicles on the road through the end of 2016. This is some data that NREL is analyzing as being made available from IHS Automotive. The other way to kind of quarter the EV market in the US is to say that about half of the vehicles on the road are currently plug-in hybrids that have a gasoline backup, and the other half are pure electric or battery electric vehicles. And so throughout the presentation, we'll abbreviate those as PHEVs and BEVs. So that's kind of what the market looks like. And so our next slide kind of talks about some of the studies that we've done looking at EV charging infrastructure. And typically what we're doing here is looking at projections that come from different organizations on what's going to happen with the electric vehicle market. And then what we're trying to do, either at the national level or at a regional level, is come in and try to estimate how much charging infrastructure is required in order to support reducing range anxiety as a barrier for these regions to meet their EV sales goals, as well as trying to ensure effective use of public and private investments in charging infrastructure and avoid things like stranded assets. So at the highest level, the three questions that we're really trying to answer are, how much charging infrastructure do you need? What kind of infrastructure do you need at workplaces and public locations, splits between lower power level 2 charging versus higher power DC fast charging, and then where should those stations be located, either within a metro area or along highway corridors, connecting metro areas, and trying to provide information on those types of questions. So we've got a box here in the lower left that shows some of our recent studies. The one that I'll focus on for this presentation is our national EV infrastructure analysis, which was published approximately a couple months ago, I believe. So moving on to the next slide, we really start to get into some of the methodology for the national assessment. And so fundamentally, I would say that we were trying to address the EV infrastructure requirement question in a couple different dimensions. So the first dimension is really looking at the trade-off between a minimum level of charging infrastructure coverage across the US and also trying to meet charging demand. So kind of the nuance there between coverage and demand is we think about coverage being somewhat insensitive to the number of vehicles that are on the road or what the market looks like. So what we're saying there is that regardless of how many vehicles on the road, there's some minimum level of coverage for charging infrastructure that would be required to enable consumers, even a small number of consumers, to have full national mobility and to be able to travel anywhere that they currently do with a gasoline vehicle. On the other hand, as the EV market grows, we would expect demand for charging stations to increase, most likely in a nonlinear manner. And so this kind of trade-off between coverage and demand is shown in the upper right of slide 4 here. And so a couple things kind of stand out here, right? So if we're assuming that there's a minimum level of infrastructure necessary for consumers to consider purchasing these vehicles, but we assume that there's not going to be very many vehicles on the road in the early stages of the market, which is where I would say that the market still is in the U.S. We end up with this utilization gap where we need so many stations to provide coverage, but we don't have enough vehicles on the road to fully utilize those stations. And as the market continues to grow, we would assume at some point that there would be a crossover where we would start to see market pull for the charging stations, where they start to become highly utilized and financially self-sufficient. And there would be kind of natural market forces that would drive the build out of additional infrastructure. So really, I think we're in the phase right now, at least in the U.S., where we're trying to overcome the classic chicken and egg problem with alternative fuel vehicles and infrastructure to support those vehicles. So the calculations we make in this report are kind of on both dimensions. So we look at a minimum level of coverage infrastructure, as well as how much demand could be produced as a result of a successful market scenario where there's a lot of vehicles on the road. So that's kind of the first dimension. The second dimension is more geographic. So looking at charging coverage and demand along corridors, as well as within communities where people live. So that's kind of the layout for how this study was structured. Slide 5 has just a quick snapshot of the geographies that we're considering in our national analysis. So here we've segmented the U.S. into 486 cities, about 3,000 towns, and then the remainder of the country is covered by what we call rural areas, which account for about 20% of the U.S. population. And then we additionally consider the U.S. interstate network as a set of corridors where we would expect to need coverage and able to allow people to travel between these cities and towns, with about 30,000 miles of interstate coverage required. Slide 6 shows the kind of the central scenario that we've developed for the analysis. And so I'll kind of take this moment to emphasize that this study was not a forecast or a projection for what will or could happen with the EV market, but rather we're using a scenario analysis to look at some interesting hypotheticals for how the EV market could evolve. And so that kind of central case that we looked at is shown in the central column of this table. And then for each of the dimensions that establish that central scenario, we explore a number of different sensitivities. And so some of the highlights of the central scenario are that we're looking at a future world where there's 15 million vehicles on the road nationally. That is derived from a linear growth from current sales up to 20% of all light-duty sales in 2030. So similar to some of the numbers that Tammy was showing from different consulting firms. So 15 million vehicles on the road, and remember that we're currently at about 500,000 vehicles, so a significant order of magnitude growth there. We're also looking at a mix of plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles. Our central scenario assumes equal shares of plug-in hybrid vehicles and battery electrics, with the majority of each type being relatively long-range vehicles. So you'll see we model about 10% of the fleet as being PHEV 20s and about 35% of the EV fleet being PHEV 50s. And then similar on the battery electric side, a higher share for the longer range vehicles. And then one of the biggest assumptions that we make in the study is that the majority of charging will happen at consumers' home locations. So in our central scenario, we're looking at about 88% of charging happening at home locations. We'll show the results of our sensitivity around that assumption, where we look at scenarios where the percent of home charging drops to 85 and 82%, which kind of on the face doesn't seem like a big shift in charging behavior, but actually does have very significant impacts on public infrastructure requirements. So the tool that we use to do these types of studies is called EVI Pro. So this is the infrastructure projection tool for electric vehicles. So we've got a schematic here that shows some of the primary inputs and outputs. So I'll kind of go through some of those. So basically what we're using are some fairly high-level vehicle attribute data, things like what are the efficiency of these vehicles, what is their battery size, what's their electric range, obviously. Similarly, we use a number of kind of high-level descriptors of the charging equipment that is on the table in these scenarios. And so typically we're looking at charging stations at home, workplace, and public locations, and then a mix of level 2, level 1, and DC fast charging at those locations. So there's efficiencies and power levels associated with all of those different EVSE or charging equipment types. And then one of the more detailed pieces of information that we use is large volumes of travel data from existing gasoline vehicles. And so these are real world GPS data sets. And so what we do with these data sets is take a broad characterization for the way that existing gasoline vehicles are driven, and then apply that to this set of electric vehicles that we're considering as being adopted, and then trying to estimate what a no compromise solution would look like for the consumers that we're modeling. And so trying to figure out how much infrastructure is required in order for people to continue driving the way that they currently drive, but doing so electrically on electric power and maximizing their electric VMT. And as I mentioned before, the kind of exogenous input to the model is really the EV sales projection. And so that's that last tile on the upper row of the schematic. And so we take that sales projection and then apply it to the simulated charging behavior and simulated EV driving that is derived from the real world travel data. So fundamentally, we're talking about future EVs being driven in a manner that's consistent with present day gasoline vehicles. However, the refueling pattern is the part that's really unique, right? We're assuming that the majority of charging would happen at the home location, and then charging at workplaces and in public locations, both along corridors and within communities, would be used as necessary in order for people to maximize their EVMT or their electric vehicle miles traveled. So one of the data sets that we've used in this national analysis is a large GPS data set from Columbus, Ohio. So this was a data set that we've acquired through a commercial GPS traffic and mapping company called INRIX. We've got similar data sets in California and Massachusetts that were also used to inform our national analysis. And so this data set from Columbus is representing 12 months of driving in the central Ohio area that contains about 1 billion miles of driving, about 33 million trips are in the data set. So it's got the advantage of being a large spatially enabled GPS data set that provides a representative cross-section of US driving on any given day. And so I don't have the vehicle miles distribution in this slide deck, but typically what we're seeing here is an average day on the order of 20 to 30 miles being driven, and then a relatively small percentage of driving days over 100 miles, approximately 5% of driving days over 100 miles. And that's the shape of that distribution is generally consistent with other surveys and driving data sets that are made available through Federal Highway and in other organizations. So these large GPS data sets are actually made up of a large number of individual bits or pieces. And so slide 9 here shows what one of those individual driving days looks like. And this example that I show is a little bit atypical because it's actually a very high mileage day, a day with a lot of driving. So in this example, there's 170 miles of driving. And so we show this example because it's relatively interesting from an EV charging standpoint. However, I'll kind of underscore that it's not a representative example, most of our driving days are closer, like I said, to 20 and 30 miles. So in this case, we're considering a travel day with 7 trips, totaling about 170 miles of driving, and then trying to simulate operation of a 100-mile battery electric vehicle without a gasoline backup, and trying to understand, what kinds of charging equipment would be necessary in order for this travel day to be accomplished in this specific vehicle. And so the result that we get from EVI Pro is a level 2 charge at work, following a 30-mile commute to work in the morning, a DC fast charge following about 70 miles of driving in the afternoon, and then a level 1 charge overnight during a 12-hour dwell at the home location. And so that's kind of the solution that EVI Pro provides. We'll iterate over a large number of travel days, and like I said, most of them aren't this interesting. Most of them can be accomplished with just a single overnight charge at the home location. But we'll loop over all of the travel data and all of the vehicle types that we're considering, and essentially we'll aggregate up. So these are bottom-up simulations where we look at individual behavior and then aggregate up both in time and space to look at a network level what the infrastructure requirements look like for a given city, state, and then across the nation as well. So these types of simulations are really good for looking at habitual daily driving patterns. One thing that we know is a significant barrier to adoption of these vehicles is the ability to make long distance trips, and quantifying the frequency and the location of long distance driving is a much more difficult task from kind of an analytic perspective, particularly because the GPS driving data sets and the travel studies that are conducted often, or in some cases, can occur over a relatively short duration, something like 1 to 7 days. And really people are making these regional or these long distance trips at a much lower frequency than that. And so one of the key enablers to our national study in order to study infrastructure requirements along corridors was a data set from Federal Highway called the Traveler Analysis Framework. And so that data set is shown here on slide 10. The upper map shows a set of origin destination pairs for long distance driving events as estimated by Federal Highway. So we've got the location and the frequency of all the driving events that Federal Highway estimates as being over 100 miles in length. And so what we've done in this study is taken all of that data and then mapped it onto the U.S. interstate highway network and looked at the volume of long distance travel along that network. And so there's a lot of good data available on traffic counts and the number of vehicles that drive on given highways on a typical day. Those data sets, in my opinion, tend to be less valuable for analysis of corridor charging, just because there's a large number of trips on any given highway that are part of a day for that individual vehicle that's much less than 100 miles. And so this data set is really valuable because it allows us to isolate for those trips that could be candidates for a DC fast charging requirement or need along these corridors, as opposed to the large number of vehicle days and trips that are much shorter in length and likely to be accomplished with only a home charge and no corridor demand. So that map really allows us to do two key things. It allows us to prioritize which corridors across the country we think are most critical for establishing corridor charging infrastructure, and also to try to make estimates on utilization of that infrastructure to inform capacity at each station, and also make estimates on financial viability of those stations in terms of how many times a day they could be used in future scenarios. And so the last bit of information on this slide is this kind of complicated chord diagram that's shown on the left. I don't know how familiar people are with these, but basically what this diagram is telling us is one simple thing, and that's that the majority of travel across the U.S. is really regional travel and not truly cross-country travel. So for this core diagram, we've broken the U.S. up into census divisions or small groups of states. So we've got the South Atlantic as a division in here, the Pacific, the Mountain, the Mid-Atlantic, the New England area. And for each of these areas, we see that the majority, even if you're just looking at long distance travel, the majority of long distance travel is within that census division. So really, I think the point here for us is to say that we know consumers have value on having true coast-to-coast mobility, but we know that in reality, the majority of charging that we should anticipate is going to really be on a regional level. And so multi-state initiatives to develop EV charging corridors are happening across the country, and I think that's kind of our work is validating that approach, that these regional corridors are really where we should be focusing most of our attention, certainly in the near term, and then moving towards a larger national network in the long term, aided by things like the investments that Volkswagen and Electrify America and Tesla and others are making. So my last slide here is really just a summary of some of the results from our national study. And so I mentioned earlier that we considered a central scenario with 15 million vehicles in this report. And we also did a number of sensitivity analysis using EVA Pro. And so those two results are shown on the top and the bottom of this screen. So on the top, kind of the headline numbers are that we're looking at approximately 8,000 DC fast charging stations being required to support a market with 15 million vehicles nationally. The majority of those stations would be located in urban areas or cities and towns, as we said in the report, with only about 400 stations being required along interstate corridors. And that number can seem relatively small, and I think the key thing to remember here is that we're assuming the majority of charging happening at home locations, and that vehicles will continue to be driven in a way that they're currently driven. So really the majority of travel is happening within cities. Home charging enables most of the charging to happen at that location. And so the interstate requirements are actually maybe a little bit smaller than some people might expect them to be. Now, that having been said, I think the interstates are going to be some of the more challenging areas to develop sustainable infrastructure, both from the standpoint of identifying the necessary electrical infrastructure, as well as making the stations financially viable, given things like potentially high demand charges in rural parts of the country, and just getting large amounts of power to relatively remote areas. And so the bottom half of the slide gets more into the sensitivity analysis that we did around our central scenario. And I think this has been the most enlightening thing for us in terms of this exercise, is trying to understand how much uncertainty there is in this space and what some of the key drivers of that uncertainty are. And so kind of from a high level, we like to say that evolution of the EV market, evolving consumer preferences, and technology development will continue to be big drivers for what an appropriate set of national infrastructure looks like to support these vehicles. And so in the sensitivity analysis, we looked at things like how many vehicles are on the road, what % of vehicles are located in cities versus in more rural areas, what's the PHEV versus BEV split, so things like that. A couple of the sensitivities that I'll highlight are the range preference sensitivity and the % home charging sensitivity. So those are the last two rows in these two figures on the bottom half of the slide. And so with the range preference sensitivity, what we looked at was the relative success of short versus long range electric vehicles. And so in our short scenario, basically we're saying that things like the first generation Nissan Leaf 100-mile BEV continues to be successful and actually ends up being kind of the dominating vehicle in the BEV space. And on the other end of the spectrum, we say, actually, what would happen if the 100-mile BEV essentially goes away and we're left with primarily long-range vehicles? And so focusing on the plot on the right on DC fast charging infrastructure, we can see a range of requirements from less than 10,000 plugs required nationally for the long-range vehicle scenario to approximately 65,000 plugs for the short-range scenario. So really what's being played out here is that the range of the vehicle is directly tied to the frequency at which it would be requiring fast charging infrastructure, at least under the assumptions and the modeling that we've done. So following the evolution of the EV market, I think, is a really important piece to pay attention to. The other sensitivity that I'll highlight, and again on the fast charging side, was the percent of home charging. And so here we looked at 88% of home charging as our central scenario, but we swept that down to 82% of charging happening at the home location and found approximately a 2.5x increase in the amount of public charging infrastructure that would be required to support these vehicles if about 6% of charging was shifted from home to non-residential locations. And so that's a big sensitivity that we want to highlight, and something that's especially important in light of trying to get these vehicles into urban areas where there's a high percentage of people that are living in multi-unit dwellings and potentially may not have access to home charging at all and could be more reliant on public charging infrastructure. And kind of also in the light of thinking about things like transportation network companies. So these are the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world, and trying to understand what the potential for electrifying those new mobility services could look like. Things like adoption of vehicles and MUDs and use of electric vehicles as ride-hailing vehicles could significantly decrease the percent of charging that happens at the home location and increase public infrastructure requirements. So that kind of wraps up the presentation. I don't know, Tammy, if you were wanting to do questions now or at the end, but either way, thank everybody for the opportunity.
We will do questions at the end. And
okay.
Dan, it looks like for you, I'm gonna go ahead and run the presentation for you, since you will need an extension to sort of be able to run it. So I'm going to run the presentation for you. I'm going to unmute you, and I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Just a second here while we pull it up.
Sure.
Okay, and we're all set. And Amy, I'll run it for you as well. I think that'll probably be the easiest. So Dan, over to you. Let's hear about the community aspects of electrifying the U.S. market.
Okay, thank you, Tammy. And let me know if at any point you can't hear me or anything like that. And,
You're perfect.
Thank you, Eric. I think that actually dovetailed quite nicely, because I'll be talking about communities that will have less home charging. So as Tammy mentioned, my name is Dan Welch. I'm from C2ES, the Center for Climate Energy Solutions, and we do go by C2ES. It's in our brand new logo down there at the bottom on the left. So go to the next slide. Quickly, it's about us. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit based in the DC area. We work towards finding pragmatic, cost-effective climate and resilience solutions, as is indicated in our name. And we work particularly with cities, states, and businesses to bring about these changes. If you go to the next slide, you can see that it's certainly not lip service for us. We do actually work with 30 mostly Fortune 500 companies. And we bring together these companies for learning, sharing, and developing new ideas and strategies. And it's sort of it's a big part of what we do. So enough about us. On the next slide, I'll just give you a quick overview of what I'll be talking about, so you know where I'll be going. So as it's been said, we'll be talking about electric vehicles, and specifically starting with the benefits. So why are these of interest to city planners? And the benefits I'll be talking about are clean air, reduced criteria air pollutants, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and potentially lower costs. And when talking about low-income communities, we're dealing with barriers that are heightened. So the upfront cost of new vehicles are more significant, and charging access is that much harder to come by, as Eric has touched on. So city planners are now starting to see the growth of electrification and wondering how they can expand their benefits to all communities, and specifically low-income communities, to be more inclusive in total of their area. And when I say city planners, I do also mean regional planners, as well as fleet managers, and anybody who is trying to operate these vehicles and plan for city and regional growth. So some of the strategies that they're employing are, first, understanding who the low-income communities are, where they are, and understanding how the community's transportation needs can be served. And then the total cost of ownership and charging access. Those are examples of finding ways to reduce the barriers for individually owned vehicles. And then for shared EV programs, those are examples both sharing cars or ride-hailing services, of expanding EV adoption or deployment beyond the individual vehicle ownership model. And then along those same lines, electrified transit and school buses. And then lastly, city planners are looking for funding resources to help the transition to electrification. And while doing so, they're sort of learning while doing and sharing their best practices. Next slide. So much of this is derived from a report we actually just put out in November, so it's hot off the presses. And it's called Electrified Transportation for All, and it is intended for city and regional planners. So it focuses on mostly benefits and strategies. It gives planners tools and considerations to consider while planning for expanding electrification. One important thing is that it does identify potential benefits for all of these different scenarios. And then it also offers 2 additional fact sheets that give both funding resources and concrete strategies. What are cities doing right now, and what are the lessons that can be learned and shared from that? So on the next slide, we'll start off with the benefits, why cities are planning on considering electrification. A big one that I've noticed in talking to some city planners is the criteria air pollutants. How can city planners get their cities and their air cleaner for all residents? As electrification expands, electrification has predominantly been in higher or middle income communities, and that is creating inequity. Low-income communities particularly are more likely to be affected by criteria air pollutants because they live near major roads or ports. And as Tammy mentioned, that creates a higher incidence of asthma, emphysema, and heart disease. So electric vehicles produce 0 tailpipe emissions, so that has the immediate effect of removing those pollutants from the roadways. Electric vehicles also help meet cities' climate emissions goals. So a Union of Concerns scientist study estimated that the average electric vehicle in the United States achieves better than 73 miles per gallon. The real numbers are likely better because that comes from 2015 EPA data. Even in the worst areas in the United States, areas that are predominantly coal-fueled power generation, EVs still achieve better than 30 miles per gallon, and they will increase their equivalent miles per gallon of greenhouse gas emissions as the grid continues to adopt more renewables. And then EVs can be less expensive to own and operate. So AAA, and I think that Tammy mentioned this before, they've found that EVs are significantly less expensive to operate, and that's mostly due to the low maintenance. And then electricity, typically, I've done some research myself, and NRDC did a separate study that indicates that electricity for electric vehicles can be about $1 a gallon equivalent. And that's very important for communities that we're talking about that have less money to begin with. One quick note from a climate and energy perspective, that electric vehicles are not the only way to achieve these benefits. Other examples would be transit-oriented development or greater investment in public transit, or even biking and walking, and that's what this photo is a reminder of. All right, next slide. So I include this photo of dense buildings because these are examples of multi-unit dwellings that Eric was referring to. So both multi-unit dwellings and rentals are significant issues for home charging. About half of all US residents right now live in rented housing units. And that's complicated because renters may not be allowed to install charging, or they may not see the value of installing the charging if it's at a landlord property and they stand to benefit. Also, access at the multi-unit dwelling might be very limited. I like to describe charging a cell phone, or charging an EV like charging a cell phone, where when you're not using it, you plug it in, it's always ready to go. That's much easier at residences, maybe a little bit harder when there's no individual garage, or shared garages might be expensive, or there's very little to no curbside parking available for electric vehicles. So the price can also be prohibitive. A new electric vehicle may be $10,000 more expensive than an equivalent vehicle, and even the new low-cost, long-range electric vehicles like the Bolt or the Model 3 are still a little bit more expensive than the average new car in the U.S. of about $32,000. So for low-income communities, it's still a concern. Tax credits are available to reduce, federal tax credits are available to reduce the upfront cost, as are some state tax credits if the federal tax credits survive until next year. But that may not apply to low-income earners anyways, because they might not have the tax burden to apply the credits, as opposed to, say, a rebate. Used EVs are actually great deals. Nissan Leaf has been described as one of the best deals in the market, though some people are not either familiar with it, or they may be concerned about the wear and tear with a used EV battery, which can cost up to $4,000. And then those incentives only apply to new vehicles, so that wouldn't help necessarily in the used market, where many low-income community residents may be shopping. Next slide. So how are cities beginning to approach this problem? Well, some are, or at least considering, beginning by defining their communities by either income or race or geographic boundaries, but however they decide they need to approach electrification in low-income communities. Demographic information is important in understanding how the best strategies for realizing electric benefits might work. I include this chart on the bottom right, something I did to estimate Kansas City's low-income commuters. This is taken from the U.S. Census Bureau, and it shows that the large pie is all commutes, and that includes that little slice that's taken out. The large pie by itself, without the little slice, is individually owned vehicles. So most commutes, the vast majority, are done in individually owned vehicles, and most of that is by not low-income earners, and that's defined here as below $25,000 or above. But you can see that little slice taken out, that it's mostly orange, and that means that the use of public transit for commuting is disproportionately used by low-income communities. So you can make a case in this community that both public transit, which is most affecting low-income communities, should be electrified, but that individually owned vehicles shouldn't be ignored either, because they make up the lion's share of commutes. Next slide. And one of those examples of how cities are considering how best to approach low-income communities is air quality. So the first image here is a heat map of Los Angeles, and that was taken from another Union of Concerned Scientists study. And on this heat map, which compares low-income population, minority population, and diesel particulate matter on the right, red is typically is higher incidences. So by comparing these images, you can see from the populations on the left and then the diesel particulate matter on the right that there's a correlation between where these populations live and where diesel particulate matter exists. So that would suggest to a city planner that electrification would provide an immediate benefit by taking the particulate matter off the road. So if we hold that thought for a second, I want to compare that to a second series of images, and this is provided by Atlas Public Policy, and provides a comparison of low-income communities and greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector in the East Bay area. So on the left, the red communities are low income, and on the right, those bubbles show greenhouse gas emissions, which are also emitted in generation sites along with criteria air pollutants. So by comparing the two, you can see that there's also correlation of siting of greenhouse gases and criteria air pollutants in low-income communities, which means that the marginal emissions from electrified transportations are meant to benefit low-income communities, but in some cases, the upstream impact may actually disproportionately negatively impact low-income communities. So these two examples are meant to provide illustrative examples of how a problem that seems relatively straightforward, such as neighborhood air quality emissions, can be muddled by upstream generation sites. These examples of data also provide, I think, a case for why cities and agencies need to collect as much of this information as possible to ensure that the electrification benefits accrue to the communities they're targeting. And increasingly, cities are beginning to discuss these strategies and information across silos, which has been difficult sometimes. Next slide. So the strategies for expanding the benefits to low-income communities are divided along the initial description I provided before. So the first being individually owned vehicles. So as I mentioned, reducing the costs is one way that cities can improve the total cost of ownership, or TCO, for low-income residents. Cities can work with states and utilities to revise rebates or advertise the used EV market, to work with dealers to participate. For one example is Southern California Edison, the California utility. They offer an innovative rebate for any EV, new or used, worth $450. That's, I believe, the first of its kind to include used vehicles. Low-cost electricity will also help improve the total cost of ownership. Time of use rates allow drivers to charge inexpensively at off-peak hours, and those can be prioritized for low-income communities. Kansas City Power and Light, for instance, has low-income rates generally. Subsidized public charging rates can also make charging away from the home, which is already more difficult, at least more affordable. And then creating greater flexibility to charge at residences. So requiring new buildings to install conduit that will reduce installation costs, rather than having to go back and trench things up, will make it easier to expand the benefits, or to expand ease of charging at multi-unit dwellings particularly. Revising laws to give tenants the right to install charging infrastructure. There are some California towns that require that. And then when that's not available, investing in public charging. In low-income communities, the residents may not be able to purchase a vehicle initially and solve their side of the chicken-egg situation. So cities can help by instead doing their parts to cut that off. Next slide. So when individual vehicle ownership isn't necessarily the best, residents of low-income communities can still experience the benefits of electrified transportation even without needing to own the vehicles. So the photo you see here is of Blue LA. That's a novel new car sharing program in Los Angeles. It's dedicated to improving air quality and residential mobility. And the program provides 200 cars at ports situated around the city's specifically low-income neighborhoods. So this is meant for equity. So the users of this vehicle program don't need to invest the upfront cost of the vehicles. And then ride-hailing programs such as Uber and Lyft are increasing both electric vehicle adoption among their drivers, as well as increasing access to electric vehicles for drivers that may rent. For instance, Lyft partners with GM to provide drivers with access to renting all electric cars, and GM has made that a priority for the Bolt. And that car, by the way, also won 2016 Motor Trend accolade as Car of the Year, not just Green Car. So the benefits aren't just for electrification, but also that there are actually reasons to be driving these cars for the drivers. Lyft also has notably committed to an electric and potentially autonomous future and has stated climate goals. So these companies, I think, can be seen as allies for cities. Shuttle services are also increasingly available and potentially an autonomous future. One just debuted in Las Vegas. You may have heard that got to a minor fender bender, but it was not the shuttle's fault, but it indicates that the technology is becoming readily apparent and on the roads, and I think it is indicative that transit in general is diversifying to including small shuttles, cars, and buses, which are all increasingly electric. Next slide. And that brings me to electric buses. So we'll start with transit buses because few cities have extensive subway and light rail systems like we do here in DC. And even those that do still rely on transit buses to connect the dots. So transit buses can be said then to provide consistent and vital mobility options for communities across the country. The average bus drives more than 30,000 miles per year. So one advantage of electrifying buses is that there's so many miles driven on zero emissions, and that these buses would be replacing diesel emissions. So the trick with these buses is that sometimes they can cost hundreds of thousands more than an equivalent diesel bus, but it's estimated that the electric buses can offset the total cost of ownership, and that's through less expensive maintenance and through fuel. Foothills Transit in California is one of the early adopters, and they had a review of their process that indicated after several years that even the early all-electric buses have been reliable and have achieved cost savings through maintenance. A King County feasibility study, and Amy will mention a little bit more about King County, but a feasibility study indicated that including the social cost of carbon, noise, and air pollutants, that the lifetime costs of vehicle ownership for all-electric buses is only 2% more than 2% more expensive than diesel hybrids. One trick as well to realizing the reduced total cost of ownership is that these fleet managers have to be very careful about demand charges. And I won't get too far into it, but buses that charge en route or even off route can accrue very expensive demand charges. And a study by Caltrans found that expensive demand charges can make the cost of fuel cost comparative with diesel. So fleet managers are developing new practices and finding new technologies to skirt demand charges. Next slide. The last strategy is school buses, electrifying school buses that approximately half of the students in the nation use. A study from the National Resources Defense Council in 2001 found that cancer-causing pollutants were several times higher inside of school buses than outside. That's obviously changed a bit since 2001. Diesel emissions have improved drastically over the past decade, but a California Air Resources Board study found in 2015 that these elevated emissions still do persist on some level. The effects on children are particularly pernicious. It's found that asthma rates in children are much higher when exposed to diesel emissions, and can have effect on school performance. So the emissions, the zero emissions will also provide a benefit not only in but near the buses at congregation points such as schools. There's some estimates that the most polluted areas in the town can be at schools due to vehicle idling. So the zero emissions are incredibly important from school buses. School buses also have higher upfront costs, not quite to the extent of transit buses, but they are more expensive. However, because of the way school buses are used less constantly, they can actually make some money back through vehicle-to-grid or vehicle-to-building technology, which is very simply the ability to reverse and put power back onto either the electrical grid or directly to a building. You can do that by providing regulating services to utility, providing that the utility allows that, and as do the public utility commissions. There's an example already from a pilot project in California where vehicle-to-building services were used to take energy from a school bus and to run CNG slow fill stations that charge the rest or fill the rest of the CNG fleet at the school. and that has saved tens of thousands of dollars already. Next slide. All right, so I just want to wrap up with giving a few examples of funding or resources that city planners are considering. So to reduce the cost of capital, which can be very difficult for some agencies to either justify, or particularly if they have separate acquisitions and operations budgets, reducing the cost of capital is critically important, and that can be found either through federal or state resources. So this is a link to the separate fact sheet we just put out. Many of you are probably quite familiar already about funding through the Volkswagen Mitigation Trust, Appendix D. The funding is available for replacing or repowering diesel vehicles or for installing EV infrastructure. The National Association of State Energy Officials put together a really great toolkit that you can find here, but C2S also has put together some materials that you'll find at the end of Amy's presentation. And then lastly, cities are beginning to understand how important it is, and that's partially through the requirements of the VW settlement, how important it is to model the impact on communities of what the cost of alternative fuel vehicle deployment will be. So greenhouse gas emissions, criteria, air pollutants, and total cost of ownership are all included in this A-Fleet model from the U.S. Department of Energy. Next slide and last slide. So just to wrap up, low-income communities are significant parts of cities, and they're also potentially significant markets. For instance, utilities typically need to demonstrate the benefits of electrification to low-income communities to public utility commissions in order to get approval for rate recovery. So the inclusion of low-income communities in electrification isn't necessarily lip service. There's also a market reason for it. So city planners, while considering their strategies, won't be using a one-size-fits-all method. Every community is unique, and the strategies that city planners develop will also be diverse and unique. As we talked about today, expanding the benefits of electrification to low-income communities will hopefully or may include expanding beyond the standard individually owned vehicle model. Funding can help make the case for easy adoption. And then lastly, a major factor when all of this is equity. I think that's why city planners are talking about this. So equal access to clean air and mobility. So I'll leave you there for more on what cities are up to. Amy will say a little bit more. Tammy?
Thank you, Dan. And I'd like to turn it over to Amy, who will talk about the local government level. But before I do, I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions, we'll take those at the end. Please use the chat box. If you would like to email me, some clients are doing that, and we'll take questions at the end. It's Tammy@futurefuelstrategies.com. Just feel free to email me if you prefer not to use the chat box. So Amy, over to you.
Great, thank you, Tammy. Well, I want to give you just a snapshot today of what local government action looks like in the alternative fuel vehicle space. I want to note there are certainly activities happening at the state level, but as you may have noticed in Dan's conversation, at C2ES, we're currently focusing on city level decision making right now, and I'll continue that focus on my slides as well. So first, I want to start with the results. Tammy, if you could go to the next slide. With the results of a recent survey we conducted in partnership with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. We are co-leading an initiative with them called the Alliance for a Sustainable Future, where we're really trying to bring mayors and business leaders together to, one, collect data, but also disseminate information to help inform and empower these two groups in their acceleration of climate solutions. So we did a survey in the summer of 2017, of all survey of cities in the United States, asking questions about renewable energy procurement, building energy policies, and as we'll talk about today, alternative transportation policies. 102 cities responded. As you see on the map there, there's kind of a nice distribution of cities across the United States. And we also had a really nice mix of small, medium, and large-sized cities. One of the things that we did in the survey was not only ask if cities are actually currently pursuing certain types of policies or activities, but also whether they were considering some of them as well. And so that additional layer to the questions also helped us think through, what can we expect in the next few years from the local level. Next slide. So first, we wanted to know about local government procurement practices. And so we found a few interesting things here. Of 99 responding cities, about 2/3 already purchased green vehicles. An additional quarter are considering doing so. And so we actually broke out those responses there in figure 2 to the right by large, medium, and small cities. So you could kind of see they're pretty similar in the way they act, regardless of size, although the large cities are moving a little bit faster here. And then at the bottom right, you see that most commonly cities are incorporating hybrid passenger vehicles into their fleets. Most also electric passenger cars, natural gas heavy duty, and hybrid light duty vehicles are found in about half of the responding cities. Other options like buses that run on natural gas, biodiesel, or electric are much less common across them, but we did find that some of the cities are responding there or are investing there. However, one thing to note here is that traditionally fueled vehicles still make up the large proportion of all city fleet vehicles, so there's plenty of opportunity to advance green vehicles here. And finally, at the bottom left, we see some evidence here that cities are looking to accelerate deployment by leveraging external funding opportunities. A majority of the cities that we spoke with are engaging with state officials on investment ideas for the VW settlement. And then perhaps not surprising, you see that kind of shift more towards large cities that maybe have more resources to engage at the state level there. Next slide. So second, we also wanted to see what cities were doing to promote consumer adoption. And we found that approximately 2/3 of cities have programs or policies in place to promote public charging, and an additional 23% are considering it. And that's pretty substantial when you think about where that number could be then in a few years. Only 14% of the cities surveyed do not have a policy or program to install public charging stations, and they're not considering them. As a note, these are mostly the smaller cities. And then when it comes to incentivizing private charging, as shown in that figure 4 right there, more than 1/3 of the cities together, it's about 41%, have policies or programs that promote private EV charging infrastructure. An additional 25% are considering such action. So this figure, you kind of see that those individual answers broken down by city size here. And then one other thing to note, less common across all the cities were purchase incentives. We found just a handful are currently offering that, but another good group are considering it. So that might be a space to watch there to see kind of what, if any, best practices emerge. Now, stepping back a little bit to like, what does this mean to have these policies in place? 2 studies from the International Council on Clean Transportation provide a little bit of guidance here. One study found that the actions to promote EVs in the 50 most populous U.S. metro areas did find a statistical link between the policies and incentives to promote EVs and consumer EV uptake. Another report from ICCT found that public charging is valuable to encouraging EV adoption, and that multifaceted collaborative approaches help the successful build out of the infrastructure. So that's just something that's kind of useful to know, that having some of these policies in place can impact the larger market. Next slide. And finally, we did ask a question about strategy. Again, as with other charts here, this is broken down by small, medium, and large cities. We asked if cities are interested in partnering with business to advance climate solutions. And we found by and large the answer is yes. And that's no surprise here. Transforming the transportation sector is really a heavy lift for a local government. So partnerships are becoming increasingly attractive to them. Many already partner with local businesses on commuter options and coordination. So what we're hearing through this survey is that they're ready to deepen their engagement here and explore new opportunities. All right, so I want to shift for the last few minutes here to some of the tangible examples we're seeing in the space. And I'll start with a quick international look here, because U.S. cities are very aware of each other, including their international counterparts, and they're often very competitive. So it is pertinent to understand what this looks like in other cities. And the first example here are something called zero emission zones. A number of cities listed here have committed to implementing these zones. Basically, that will happen in significant sections of major areas in town. And in the coming years, they're designing these policies so that the restrictions will progressively expand, either through the geography that's covered or the vehicle type that's allowed. Eventually allowing only electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell vehicles to enter. You might have noticed Paris has gone a step further to propose banning all vehicles powered by ICEs from the city by 2030. Another example here is kind of a supporting policy to these zero emission cities. London has a congestion charge for charging 11.5 pounds per car. So the city doesn't necessarily outlaw non-zero emission vehicles today, but that charge will certainly help kind of send the message to drivers to start moving in a cleaner direction. Next slide. So as advertised, a couple examples of what's going on here in the United States. It's useful to know that automakers are expanding their options and in some ways making pretty unprecedented commitments. They're going to be, really putting a lot of focus on EVs in the coming years, whether it's Volvo, GM, Ford, Toyota, Volkswagen. All of these developments are opening the door for local governments to make some moves here. And I would say, there are a number of emerging city leaders in fleet adoption. More than 30 U.S. cities have issued a request for proposals for an order of more than 110,000 EVs for a broad range of activities. And so I think that kind of aggregation of a purchase order is quite interesting. And it's a signal to the market that the market can step up and satisfy some of this demand. And of course, many cities are adopting EVs directly into their fleets, as we've kind of been mentioning throughout. Examples, Austin has almost 300 EVs in its fleet. New York City is approaching 1,000. And so they're pretty substantial across the board here. And then, just one last note there that some of this interest is really spurring some interesting utility partnerships. New York City is doing this. Seattle is working with its utility to just basically increase access to charging. And I think that's probably pretty important to some of the conversations we've been having here today. Next slide. And lastly, in terms of what it looks like on the ground here in the United States, we do need to look at heavy-duty vehicles. And by way of some background, it might not be a surprise to folks on the call here that heavy-duty EVs were recently seen as a niche or maybe even a non-existent market, but now that's starting to change because of the growing list of options from suppliers, whether that's purpose-built all-electric transit buses, school bus makers that are creating a number of options for school districts, and then a number of different heavy-duty vehicle options like tractor trailers and port vehicles. So for now, looking at some of the early adopters, those 12 cities that we mentioned earlier that are doing the zero emission zones are also committing to purchasing only electric buses by 2025. There are 2 U.S. cities in that group, which are Seattle and LA. Where are they now? Well, there are at least 100 buses in Seattle. LA is putting in a purchase order for 95. And, as a side note, that, this isn't only happening in the U.S. In Canada, Winnipeg Transit has also got these transit vehicles on the road, and that's interesting because the weather there is typically what you would expect to be non-conducive to an electric battery, and it's going well. And then, there are a number of other examples, but I know we're hitting up against time here, so I do want to leave some space for questions. Last slide. And just as a note about some of the resources that we have from C2ES, Dan mentioned his electrified transportation brief. There's a link there. We've produced a guide on financing EV infrastructure, as well as what cities should know about the VW settlement. And then just a last plug here. We do put out a weekly newsletter called the PEV Clips. If you'd like to join that, you can just send an email to Dan. It's welchd@c2es.org. And I'll end there. Tammy, I don't know if you're on mute, if you're switching over to questions.
Yes, thank you. I just was talking and totally muted. Again, unmuting is the biggest challenge. So thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate your presentation, as well as Dan's and Eric's. We are running up against time, but we do have some time for questions, and I want to make sure that we leave time for questions. So I'm going to unmute Dan and Eric. If you have questions, please use the chat box, and I can see that folks have emailed as well. So while people are thinking and chewing on a lot of material presented today, I'm going to ask a question directed to all 3 of you, and that is, how do you guys view this proposal to within Congress as part of the tax reform package to end the electric vehicle tax credit? So how do you guys view that in terms of the potential impacts?
Well, I can start off. I would say that since the purchase price of new vehicles is still consistently thought of as an ongoing barrier, and even though the price of new vehicles is coming down, that the reduction of $7,500, which is nearly 20% or even more of one of these new next generation vehicles, would be significant. It's something that is somewhat baked into the costs of these vehicles, and it's important to note that after 200,000 vehicles sold, each automaker then will be ramping down for the number of eligible incentives that they can apply, but they're still for the most part, a little ways off. So I think that would be taking away a pretty important incentive and tool for expanding the adoption of electric vehicles.
Anyone else care to share a view?
I can probably only really echo those sentiments. That tax credit is a big deal. The purchase price is a significant barrier. So I'm not sure there's much else to say on that front.
Okay. Okay, Amy?
Nothing to add. I think you guys covered.
Okay, so the question has come in about the costs for infrastructure, and I'm not sure who this is directed to, but maybe you all can speak to it. I guess, in terms of the study that you've done, Eric, with colleagues at NREL, and also, what you and Amy are doing, Dan and Amy at the city level and working with low-income communities. What are we really looking at here in terms of the costs for putting in the infrastructure? I mean, yes, we have a multi-billion-dollar fund from Volkswagen, but I guess if you're looking at the city level, just to build on this client's question, I guess to build on it, this is quite an undertaking. We're coming out of a period where there has been recession. Some states and localities have not been doing well fiscally. So what are we looking at in terms of costs? And from the city perspective, where is that going to come from?
Yeah, so on the NREL analysis, cost was not included explicitly in the analysis. There are some other reports from Department of Energy that get into more of the cost details behind these systems. I think it's fairly obvious that the stations themselves aren't to a point yet where they're standalone financially profitable. I think one of the big motivations, at least in terms of locating them at retail locations, is the idea that you can derive incidental revenue by having the stations there. You might encourage customers to visit your store as opposed to someone else's. So that's part of the equation. But from my perspective, the really difficult thing is just the size of the vehicle market right now. I think our idea that you need some minimum level of coverage kind of makes sense, but you're really going to be undersaturated in terms of utilization of those assets until the market grows to some much larger state. And so things like demand charges at DC fast charge stations are a significant barrier. Installation costs can be very expensive on the fast charging side, depending on what site you're looking at and access to three-phase power. So those are some of the things that we like to think about. And there are some other reports that I could provide people links to if they're interested in more detailed financial studies of the infrastructure.
Thanks, Eric. Dan or Amy, care to venture?
Sure. So along those lines, C2ES also about 2 years ago put together a report on new business models, as well as a separate report on short-term actions to help finance public charging infrastructure. So if you have any questions or you'd like to know more, you can either search our site or let me know. One thing I don't want to miss is when, I don't know if this is your inclusion, Tammy, or the part of the question, but about the VW fund for EV charging infrastructure. I want to clarify that. Okay. Yeah, I think it's important because I think there's some uncertainty, and this is something I've been talking about recently, particularly with Electrify America, is that the 15% of the total fund, and that's the amount allocated to each state, can be used for charging infrastructure, but the separate Appendix C, the ZEV investment, is being entirely handled by Electrify America, and that they are investing as a private company, even though it's going to be at least $2 billion. That is their sort of prerogative to do so. but it's also, I think, interesting because they are trying to make it a profitable business model. And in that sense, they're taking a leap where some other automakers haven't jumped quite as precipitously to try to make a successful business model out of fast charging and community charging. And that sort of gets me to where is the money going to come from? Automakers, I think, are our natural partners. Nissan has helped install large amounts of DC fast charging. At least in Europe, there is a recent example, or a recent announcement of 400 DC fast chargers that will be installed by automakers in a network across the continent. And then utilities. Utilities, where they're allowed to participate in the markets, I think have great interest and have already started developing plans to be involved. And they will typically bear the cost of charging infrastructure as well.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Amy, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I would just add that, I think the landscape is changing, and so it's something to keep up with. Shell just acquired a charging company that I believe will focus more on European companies, but does that signal a change for how they might approach their gasoline stations here in the United States? It's possible, and so if you see them switch over, that might kind of also cross a tipping point in how to create more accessibility here.
Okay. Last question I have is about car bans or car restrictions or zero emission vehicle zones. So, as you talked about, Amy, many cities. I mean, I've actually been tracking this for clients, and it's really, it's over 20 cities and 3 or 4 countries that are either implementing zero emission vehicle zones, they're banning cars, or the country itself has committed to phasing out the internal combustion engines. But most of those cities are they're in Europe. The countries that have committed include 2 Asian countries, India and China. We have a few Latin American cities like Mexico City that have in place zero emission vehicle zones. So my question is, do you see cities in the U.S. Going in that direction, either creating zero emission vehicle zones or expanding them, or taking other sorts of routes? Like, one of the things that I've been looking at is like parking restrictions. I mean, that's a way to kind of restrict vehicles without actually, banning the car. So do you see cities moving in that direction more and more, simply to address congestion, air pollution, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think political context is important. I don't hear a lot of local leaders actively exploring the idea of zero emission zones here in the United States. I think the interest is more in government as a leader, so making sure that they're procuring the low emission vehicles and one, kind of driving the market that way, but also showing other people that these vehicles are useful options. And then, yeah, you mentioned the parking restrictions. I see that as an area where there's probably a little bit more comfort from local leaders to start, I guess, kind of tweaking and moving in a certain direction.
I think this may be a policy question as well as a technology question, because some of the leaders you mentioned are really the early adopters. But as autonomous technologies develop, there's, I think, more of a capacity to eschew vehicle ownership broadly, or at least revise how we use vehicles in cities. And these vehicles may be shared, they may require less space, and they might be fully electric to begin with. So the future may be defined by when these technologies are available and how they can be deployed. So it may be more of a technology issue to a certain extent. Once the technology is there, then when the early adopters, the politicians, make these announcements or have these goals.
Okay, Eric, care to add anything?
I think you guys have it covered.
Okay, thank you. All right, just check my email real quick. Okay, so thank you all so much for your time today. Again, I hope this was useful and valuable. I want to thank Eric, Dan, and Amy so much for being with us today and talking about, getting into some of the nitty-gritty issues with respect to, growing the electric vehicle market, the challenges, the opportunities. I especially want to thank Dan Welch for organizing this with me and being such a sport for helping me put this together. That's really the goal here, is to bring in different voices, be it from government, from industry, and from NGOs, to sort of provide insight into their work, where they're coming from, and hopefully benefit you and your work. Stay tuned for the next web conference. It will be in February, after the holidays, early February. That one's going to focus on hydrogen. Our speakers are going to come from Toyota, Total, and DOE's ARPA-E, talking about different aspects of hydrogen. Until then, for those of you in the United States, I wish you a very happy Thanksgiving. The presentation, the recording presentations and recordings will be posted most likely later this afternoon. The transcript will probably come next week sometime, barring disruptions from the holiday. And I wish you a good rest of your day. Take care.